At the family lunch, my daughter-in-law leaned into my ear and whispered, "Your husband called me love last night." I held back my laughter. 3 weeks later, she received a little box from the lab and left the house in tears. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how it really started, because what Claire whispered to me that Sunday afternoon wasn't about being called love at all. It was something far more devastating, something that would make me question everything I thought I knew about my marriage to Robert. I had spent the entire morning preparing for our monthly family lunch. At 65, these gatherings had become sacred to me, especially since Robert passed away 2 years ago. The dining room table was set with my grandmother's china. The pot roast was perfectly tender, and I'd even made Robert's favorite apple pie from scratch. Everything had to be perfect for my son David, my granddaughter Emma, and of course, Claire. Claire had been part of our family for 6 years now, ever since she married David. On the surface, she was everything you'd want in a daughter-in-law. Beautiful, well-educated, always impeccably dressed. She worked in marketing for a pharmaceutical company.
Before we continue, comment where you're watching from and subscribe to the channel. We'd love to see how far our stories are reaching.
And spoke with the confidence of someone who was used to getting her way. But there was something about her that had always made me uneasy, though I could never quite put my finger on it. That Sunday, she arrived wearing a cream-colored dress that probably cost more than my monthly Social Security check. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a sleek chignon, and her makeup was flawless as always. She kissed my cheek with practiced warmth, the kind of affection that looked genuine from the outside, but felt hollow when you were on the receiving end. "Margaret, everything smells wonderful," she said, her voice carrying that slight Southern accent she claimed came from her childhood in Georgia. "You've really outdone yourself." David beamed at his wife's compliment, wrapping his arm around her waist. At 38, my son still looked at Claire like she was the most amazing woman in the world. It broke my heart sometimes, watching him worship someone who I suspected didn't deserve his devotion. "Mom always makes the best Sunday dinners," David said, kissing my forehead. "Remember how Dad used to say your pot roast could solve any problem?" The mention of Robert sent a familiar pang through my chest. Even after 2 years, I still expected him to walk through the front door, hang up his coat, and ask what smelled so good. He'd been the center of our family for 43 years, and his absence still felt like a missing piece in every gathering. "Grandma, can I have extra gravy?" Emma asked, climbing onto the chair beside me. At 8 years old, she was the light of my life. With David's dark eyes and Claire's stubborn chin, she was the one pure joy that had come from my son's marriage. "Of course, sweetheart," I said, spooning an extra portion onto her plate. "But you have to eat your vegetables too." Emma wrinkled her nose but nodded, and I couldn't help but smile. She reminded me so much of David at that age, always negotiating for better terms. The conversation flowed easily through the first course. David talked about his promotion at the insurance company. Emma chattered about her school play, and Claire made appropriate comments and questions. She was good at that, playing the part of the interested family member. But I noticed things others didn't. The way her smile never quite reached her eyes when Emma spoke about school, the subtle eye roll when David mentioned his work stress, the way she checked her phone under the table when she thought no one was looking. It was when I went to the kitchen to get the pie that Claire followed me. I was arranging slices on my best dessert plates when I felt her presence behind me. She moved with the quiet grace of someone who was used to getting close to people without being noticed. "Margaret," she said softly, her voice taking on an intimate tone I'd never heard from her before. "I need to tell you something Robert shared with me during his final weeks." My hands stilled on the pie server. Claire had barely visited during Robert's illness, claiming work obligations and a weak stomach around sick people. I couldn't imagine when she would have had intimate conversations with my dying husband. "What do you mean?" I asked, not turning around. Something in her tone made me afraid to see her face. She stepped closer, close enough that I could smell her expensive perfume mixed with something else. Excitement, maybe, or malice. "He told me about the separate bedrooms," she whispered, her breath warm against my ear. "How you two hadn't shared a bed in months. How lonely he was. How much he regretted not leaving you years ago." The pie server slipped from my fingers, clattering against the ceramic plate. The sound seemed impossibly loud in the sudden silence of the kitchen. "He said the marriage had been dead for years," Claire continued, her voice gaining strength from my shocked silence. That he only stayed because divorce would have been too expensive and complicated at your age. He was so unhappy, Margaret, so desperately unhappy. I turned around slowly, my heart hammering against my ribs. Claire's face was a mask of false sympathy, but there was something gleaming in her green eyes that looked almost like satisfaction. "That's not true," I whispered. But even as I said it, doubt began creeping in. It was true that Robert and I had slept in separate rooms during his final months. His treatments made him restless at night, and the hospital bed was easier for him to manage alone. But that was medical necessity, not marital breakdown. "I'm sorry to be the one to tell you," Claire said, reaching out to touch my arm with perfectly manicured fingers. "But I thought you should know. He confided in me because he needed someone to talk to, someone who would understand." "When?" I managed to ask. "When did he tell you this?" "During one of his treatments. I ran into him at the cancer center when I was there for a work meeting. We were consulting on a new pain management protocol. He looked so lost, so alone. We got to talking, and he just opened up to me. The explanation sounded plausible, but something about it felt wrong. Claire worked for a pharmaceutical company, and the cancer center would have been a logical place for a work meeting, but Robert had never mentioned seeing her there, and he'd always been meticulous about telling me who he'd encountered during his appointments. "He made me promise not to tell you while he was alive," Claire continued. "He didn't want to hurt you more than necessary. But I think you deserve to know the truth now. I think it might help you understand why he seemed so distant. Toward the end, the words hit me like physical blows. Robert had seemed distant during his final weeks, but I'd attributed that to pain and medication, not unhappiness with our marriage. Had I been so focused on his physical care that I'd missed his emotional suffering? "Margaret? Claire? Everything okay in there?" David's voice called from the dining room. "Just fine," Claire called back, her voice bright and cheerful. "Your mom was just telling me about the pie recipe." She leaned closer to me one more time, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "I hope you don't think badly of him for confiding in me. He just needed someone to listen. Someone who wouldn't judge him for being honest about his feelings." With that, she picked up 2 plates of pie and walked back to the dining room, leaving me alone with my shattered world. I stood there for several minutes, trying to process what she'd told me. The separate bedrooms, the loneliness, the regret. It painted a picture of the end of my marriage that was completely different from what I'd believed. But was it true? When I finally returned to the dining room with the remaining pie, my hands were shaking so badly I had to concentrate on each step. Claire was chatting animatedly with David about their upcoming vacation plans, as if she hadn't just destroyed my understanding of my marriage. "Mom, are you feeling all right?" David asked, noticing my pallor. "You look pale." "Just tired," I managed. "It's been a long day." Emma looked up from her pie with concern. "Are you sick, Grandma?" "No, sweetheart," I said, forcing a smile for her sake. "Grandma's just fine." But I wasn't fine. As I watched Claire laugh at something David said, her perfect facade never slipping, I realized I had just become the victim of either the cruelest revelation or the most vicious lie I'd ever encountered, and I had no idea which one it was. The next 3 weeks were the darkest of my life since Robert's funeral. Claire's words echoed in my mind during every quiet moment, poison seeping through my memories like ink through water. I found myself dissecting every interaction from Robert's final months, searching for signs I might have missed. Had he really been that unhappy? The separate bedrooms suddenly seemed less about his medical needs and more about emotional distance. His quiet moments, which I'd attributed to pain and fatigue, now felt like the silence of a man trapped in a loveless marriage. Even his gentle touches, which I'd treasured as signs of enduring affection, began to feel like obligations performed out of duty rather than desire. I stopped sleeping properly. Every night, I lay in the bed we'd shared for 43 years, staring at the empty space where he used to sleep. The room felt enormous and cold, filled with the weight of Claire's revelations. During the day, I moved through my routine like a ghost, watering plants he'd helped me choose, cooking meals he'd never eat again, all while wondering if he'd been planning to leave me if cancer hadn't taken him first. The worst part was the isolation. I couldn't talk to David about this. How could I tell my son that his father might have confided marital problems to his wife instead of his own family? I couldn't burden Emma with adult concerns. And my few close friends from church were the type who believed in preserving the sanctity of marriage memories. They would have been horrified by the very suggestion that Robert had been unhappy. So I suffered alone, which was exactly what Claire had intended. She called me on a Tuesday afternoon 2 weeks after the lunch. I almost didn't answer, but some masochistic part of me needed to hear her voice, to try to read something in her tone that might tell me whether she was telling the truth. "Margaret, how are you holding up?" she asked, her voice dripping with false concern. "I've been thinking about our conversation, and I hope I didn't upset you too much. I just felt you deserved to know the truth." "I'm fine," I lied, my voice hoarse from crying the night before. "I'm glad to hear that. It takes a strong woman to handle difficult truths with grace." She paused, and I could hear her taking a sip of something, probably her usual afternoon latte. "Actually, there's something else Robert shared with me that I wasn't sure whether to mention." My stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" "Well, he talked about how you used to be when you were younger, how vibrant and interesting you were when he first met you. He said marriage and motherhood had changed you, made you more settled, domestic. He missed the woman you used to be." Each word was a calculated strike. Claire knew exactly how to hurt me, by making me question not just whether Robert loved me, but whether I'd become someone unworthy of love. "He said that?" I whispered. "He was very gentle about it," Claire continued, her tone suggesting she was doing me a kindness by sharing this. "He understood that people change, that life has a way of wearing down the spark that first attracts us to someone. But he did seem wistful about it, about the woman he'd fallen in love with." I closed my eyes, remembering the young woman I'd been when Robert and I met. I had been vibrant then, working as a nurse, traveling when I could afford it, full of dreams and energy. But marriage, motherhood, and 43 years of building a life together had indeed changed me. I'd become focused on family, on creating a stable home, on being the kind of wife and mother I thought they needed. Had that been a mistake? Had I sacrificed the very qualities that made Robert fall in love with me in the first place? "I shouldn't have told you that," Claire said, though her tone suggested she was quite pleased with herself. "I can hear in your voice that it's upset you. Please don't dwell on it, Margaret. The past is the past, and Robert did love you in his own way. It just wasn't the same kind of love he'd felt in the beginning." She hung up before I could respond, leaving me alone with this new revelation. Not the same kind of love he'd felt in the beginning. The phrase haunted me for days. I started going through old photo albums, trying to see myself through Robert's eyes. There I was at 25, laughing at some joke he'd made, my hair wild from dancing at our wedding reception. At 30, holding baby David, tired but glowing with new motherhood. At 40, 50, 60, each decade showing a woman who looked progressively more settled, more matronly, more domestic. When had I stopped being the woman who stayed up all night talking about dreams and started being the woman who reminded everyone to take their vitamins? When had I traded adventure for routine, passion for comfort? The third call came a week later. This time, Claire's timing was particularly cruel. She called on the anniversary of Robert's diagnosis, a date she couldn't possibly have known was significant unless she'd been paying very close attention to our family's private timeline. "I hope this isn't a difficult day for you," she said, though her tone suggested she knew exactly what day it was. I was just thinking about Robert and something he told me about regrets. I should have hung up. I should have told her I didn't want to hear any more of his supposed confessions. Instead, I found myself asking, what kind of regrets? Professional ones, mostly. He said he'd always wondered what would have happened if he'd taken that job offer in California when David was young. He felt like he'd chosen security over opportunity, and it haunted him. She paused for effect. "He said you'd been against the move because you didn't want to leave your family and friends. He never blamed you for it, but he wondered if his whole life might have been different if he'd been braver." This revelation hit differently because it was true. There had been a job offer in California when David was 10. It would have meant a significant promotion for Robert and a chance to work on larger projects that excited him. But I had been terrified of moving so far from my support system, especially with a young child. We'd talked about it for weeks, and ultimately, Robert had turned it down. He'd never expressed regret about the decision. He'd said family stability was more important than career advancement, that he was happy with the choice we'd made together. But had he been lying to spare my feelings? Had he spent 30 years wondering what might have been? He was very philosophical about it, Claire continued. He said that's the price of marriage. Sometimes you have to sacrifice your dreams for the greater good of the family, but I could tell it still bothered him. The what-ifs, you know? After she hung up, I sat in Robert's old chair, the recliner where he'd spent so many evenings reading or watching television, and tried to reconcile the man I'd loved with the man Claire was describing. A man who regretted his marriage, who missed the woman I used to be, who felt trapped by the very family commitments I'd thought were the foundation of our happiness. It was that evening that I made a decision that would change everything. I couldn't continue living with these doubts, couldn't spend the rest of my life wondering if my marriage had been a lie. I needed to know the truth, and there was only one way to find out. I called Dr. Martinez, Robert's oncologist, and made an appointment under the pretense of needing to discuss some of his final medical bills. Dr. Martinez had been with us through the entire journey of Robert's illness, and if anyone would know about his emotional state during treatment, it would be him. The appointment was scheduled for Friday afternoon. As I drove to the medical center, I rehearsed what I would say, how I would casually bring up Robert's mental state during his final weeks. I needed to know if he'd seemed depressed or regretful, if he'd mentioned feeling trapped or unhappy in his marriage. But when I arrived at the office, I discovered something that made my blood run cold. The receptionist, a young woman I'd spoken with dozens of times during Robert's treatment, looked confused when I mentioned Claire's supposed work meeting at the facility. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Patterson, but we don't have any pharmaceutical consultants working here. Our pain management protocols are handled entirely by our in-house staff. We haven't had any outside companies doing presentations or meetings in over 2 years." The room seemed to tilt around me. If Claire had never had a work meeting at the cancer center, then when had she supposedly encountered Robert? When had these intimate conversations taken place? "Are you sure?" I asked, my voice barely steady. "My daughter-in-law works for a pharmaceutical company, and she mentioned meeting my husband here during one of his appointments." The receptionist checked her computer, frowning. "No, I'm certain. We have very strict policies about outside vendors, and everything has to be pre-approved and documented. There's no record of any pharmaceutical company meetings or presentations." I thanked her and left the office in a daze. The first crack had appeared in Claire's story, and I felt something I hadn't experienced in weeks: hope. If she'd lied about how she'd encountered Robert, what else had she lied about? That night, I began to plan. I would find out the truth about Claire's claims, one way or another. I owed it to Robert's memory, and I owed it to myself. But first, I needed to be very, very careful. Because if Claire was capable of lying about intimate conversations with my dying husband, she was capable of much worse, and I was beginning to understand that I was dealing with someone far more dangerous than I'd ever imagined. The weekend after my visit to Dr. Martinez's office, I became a detective in my own life. If Claire had lied about meeting Robert at the cancer center, I needed to find out what other lies she might have told. More importantly, I needed to understand how she could have known such intimate details about our marriage if she hadn't actually spoken with Robert. I started with what I knew to be true. The separate bedrooms had been real, but they'd begun only after Robert's second round of chemotherapy made his sleep so restless that he kept me awake all night. The hospital bed rental company still had records of when we'd ordered it. March 15th, just 3 months before he died. Before that, we'd shared our bed every single night of our marriage. The California job offer was also real, but it had happened 28 years ago, not something Robert would have been dwelling on during his final illness. If anything, he'd seemed grateful for the life we'd built together in those last weeks. He'd often talked about how lucky he felt to be dying in the home we'd created, surrounded by memories of our life together. But if Claire hadn't spoken with Robert, how did she know these things? The answer came to me slowly, like a photograph developing in a dark room. Claire had been coming to our house for 6 years. She'd heard family stories, observed our dynamics, been present for conversations about the past. She was intelligent enough to piece together information and present it in a way that seemed like intimate revelation. But there was something else, something that made my stomach turn when I really thought about it. During Robert's illness, Claire had barely visited. She'd claimed to be squeamish around sick people, allergic to the smell of medical equipment, too busy with work to come by often. But what if that hadn't been entirely true? I went to Robert's study, a small room off our living room where he'd kept his files and personal papers. I hadn't been able to bring myself to go through everything yet, but now I had a purpose. I was looking for anything that might tell me about his final weeks. Appointment cards, medication schedules, anything that might show when Claire could have had access to personal information. What I found was worse than I'd imagined. In a folder marked medical appointments, I discovered something that made my hands shake. Robert had kept meticulous records of his treatments, including notes about how he was feeling each day. The handwriting became increasingly shaky as his condition worsened, but his thoughts were clear and heartbreakingly honest. March 20th. Moved to guest room so Em can sleep. Hate being separated but can't keep waking her up. She looks so tired. April 2nd. Em brought me soup in bed. Still beautiful after all these years. How did I get so lucky? April 15th. Scared about dying. Not for me, but for Em. How will she manage alone? David thinks she's stronger than she is, but I see how much she needs our partnership. April 28th. Bad day. Pain medication making me confused. Em was patient with me even when I couldn't remember what day it was. She's been my anchor through all of this. May 10th. Told Em today that marrying her was the best decision I ever made. Meant every word. If I have regrets about anything, it's that we won't grow old together like we planned. Each entry painted a picture of a man deeply in love with his wife, grateful for their life together, worried only about leaving her alone. There was no mention of regret about their marriage, no longing for the woman I used to be, no feeling of being trapped or unhappy. But there was something else in that folder that made everything click into place. Tucked between his appointment cards was a small digital recorder, the kind elderly patients sometimes use to remember their doctor's instructions. I'd forgotten Robert had started using it when the medication made his memory fuzzy. With trembling fingers, I pressed play. Robert's voice filled the room, weak but unmistakable. The recording was from April 30th, just 6 weeks before he died. At first, it was just him talking to himself, trying to remember medication times. But then I heard another voice in the background. Mr. Patterson, I'm sorry to bother you, but Margaret asked me to check on you while she went to the pharmacy. It was Claire. Oh, hello, dear. How thoughtful of Margaret to ask you to stop by. Robert's voice was fuzzy, clearly affected by his pain medication. This must have been one of his bad days, when the drugs made him confused and disoriented. How are you feeling today? Claire asked, her voice dripping with false sympathy. Not so good, I'm afraid. The pain is pretty bad, and these medications make my head feel like cotton. I can't think straight half the time. That must be frustrating for someone as sharp as you've always been. It is. Sometimes I can't even remember what day it is. Margaret has to remind me to take my pills, help me to the bathroom. I hate being such a burden on her. My heart broke hearing the pain in Robert's voice. He'd never told me he felt like a burden. I would have done anything to reassure him that caring for him was a privilege, not an obligation. I'm sure that's difficult, Claire said. It must be hard feeling so dependent when you've always been the strong one in the relationship. Yes, exactly. Margaret's been so patient, but I can see how tired she is. We had to move to separate bedrooms because I keep her awake at night. I feel like I'm failing her as a husband. Separate bedrooms can be hard on a marriage, Claire said, and I could hear the calculation in her voice even through the recording. It's just temporary, Robert said quickly. Just until I'm feeling better. We've shared a bed for 43 years. I miss having her close, but Claire wasn't finished. Do you ever think about the choices you made? The paths not taken? Robert was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice was even more confused. What do you mean? Oh, just wondering if you have any regrets. Most people do when they're facing their mortality. Regrets? Robert's voice was thoughtful, drug-addled. There was that job in California years ago. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if we'd moved. But no, I don't regret staying. This is home. Margaret and David, this house, our life here. That's what matters. But you do wonder about California sometimes? Sure. I guess everyone wonders about roads not taken. But wondering isn't the same as regretting. I'm grateful for the life we built here. The recording continued for several more minutes, with Claire asking leading questions, and Robert giving confused, Medication-influenced answers that she would later twist into admissions of unhappiness and regret. She was like a prosecutor cross-examining a witness who wasn't capable of understanding the implications of his words. The worst part came near the end of the recording. "You know, Mr. Patterson, I think about marriage a lot, about how people change over the years. Do you think Margaret is the same woman you married?" Robert's answer was slow, clearly struggling through the medication fog. "Same? No, I suppose not. None of us are the same as when we were young. Margaret's become more settled, I guess, more focused on home and family. She gave up nursing when David was born, gave up a lot of her independence to take care of us. Do you miss the woman she used to be? Miss her? No, that's not. I mean, yes, sometimes I think about the girl I met, how full of life she was, but I love the woman she became too. Maybe even more. She chose us, chose our family over her own dreams. How could I not love that?" But in Claire's twisted retelling, Robert's nostalgic remembering of my younger self had become longing for a woman who no longer existed. His gratitude for my sacrifices had become resentment of his lost opportunities. I listened to the entire recording twice, my heart breaking for Robert's vulnerability, and my fury growing at Claire's manipulation. She had taken a sick, medicated man's confused rambling and turned them into weapons against his widow. But this recording was proof that Robert had never confided in Claire willingly, proof that she had manipulated a dying man's words, proof that everything she'd told me was a deliberate distortion designed to torture me. I had the evidence I needed. Now I had to decide what to do with it. That night I called Claire. "Margaret," she sounded surprised to hear from me. "How are you doing?" "I found something interesting today," I said, my voice steady despite the rage coursing through me. "A recording Robert made during one of his confused episodes." The silence on the other end of the line was telling. "I think we need to talk," I continued. "In person. Tomorrow." "I'm not sure what you mean," Claire said, but her voice had lost its confident edge. "I think you know exactly what I mean. 1 o'clock tomorrow. Your house. And Claire, yes, bring David. It's time he learned the truth about his wife." I hung up before she could respond, my heart pounding with something I hadn't felt in weeks. Power. The hunt was about to begin. I didn't sleep at all that night. Instead, I sat at my kitchen table with Robert's recorder, a notebook, and a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago, planning exactly how I would expose Claire's cruelty. This wasn't just about clearing Robert's name anymore. It was about protecting my family from a woman capable of exploiting a dying man's vulnerability for her own twisted purposes. The recording was damning, but I needed to be strategic about how I presented it. David loved Claire, and people in love don't want to see the truth about their partners, even when it's staring them in the face. I had to make this so clear, so undeniable, that even my besotted son couldn't explain it away. By morning, I had a plan. At exactly noon, I drove to David and Claire's house, a beautiful colonial in the suburbs that they'd bought 3 years ago. I'd helped with the down payment, something that now seemed naive, given what I knew about Claire's character. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was about to destroy their marriage in a home I'd helped them afford. David answered the door, looking confused and concerned. "Mom, what's this about? Claire said you found some recording. Where is Claire?" I asked, stepping into their foyer without waiting for an invitation. "In the living room." "Mom, you're scaring me." "What recording?" I followed him into their pristine living room, where Claire sat on their white sofa, looking perfectly composed. She was wearing a blue dress that brought out her eyes, her hair styled in soft waves. Even facing potential exposure, she looked like a woman who believed she could charm her way out of any situation. "Margaret," she said, rising to kiss my cheek as if this were a normal family visit. "You look tired. I hope you're not letting stress affect your health." The sheer audacity of her concern, knowing what she'd put me through, made my jaw clench. But I forced myself to smile. "Actually, I'm feeling much better, clearer than I've felt in weeks." David gestured for me to sit down. "Mom, what's this about a recording?" I remained standing, pulling Robert's digital recorder from my purse. "Before we discuss that, I have a few questions for Claire." Claire's composure flickered slightly, but she maintained her innocent expression. Of course. What would you like to know? Tell me again about your work meeting at the cancer center. The one where you ran into Robert. I already explained that. We were consulting on pain management protocols. Interesting. I spoke with the staff there on Friday. They have no record of any pharmaceutical consultations in the past 2 years. Their pain management protocols are handled entirely in-house. David frowned, looking between us. Maybe it was a different medical facility? No, Claire said quickly. It was definitely the cancer center. Perhaps the receptionist was mistaken, or maybe it was an informal consultation that wasn't officially documented. I nodded as if accepting her explanation. That's possible. But tell me, how many times did you visit with Robert during these supposed conversations? Just the once? Really? Like I said, we ran into each other and talked. Just once. But you told me he confided multiple things. His unhappiness with our marriage, his regrets about the California job, his feelings about how I'd changed over the years. That's quite a lot to share with someone he barely knew, in a single conversation. Claire shifted slightly on the sofa. Well, it might have been more than once. The details blur together. Mom, where are you going with this? David asked, his voice strained. I'm establishing that your wife has been lying to me for weeks. I held up the recorder. Because Robert did make recordings during his illness. Not intentionally. He used this device to remember his medication schedule when the drugs made his memory fuzzy. But sometimes it picked up other things. The color drained from Claire's face. I don't know what you think you found, but I found a recording from April 30th. A recording of you visiting Robert while I was at the pharmacy. A recording of you interrogating a sick, confused man and twisting his words to use against his widow. David stared at his wife. Claire, what is she talking about? I have no idea. Margaret's been under a lot of stress since our conversation. Perhaps she's misinterpreting. Shall we listen to it? I pressed play without waiting for an answer. Robert's weak voice filled the room, followed by Claire's false sympathy. I watched David's face change as he heard his dying father's confusion, his medication-addled state, his vulnerable admissions about feeling like a burden. When Claire's voice came through the speaker, asking leading questions and manipulating Robert's responses, David's expression shifted to horror. Do you ever think about the choices you made, the paths not taken? But you do wonder about California sometimes? Do you think Margaret is the same woman you married? Each question was calculated, designed to extract admissions that could later be weaponized. But on the recording, Robert's love for me was clear, even through his confusion, his gratitude for our life together, his worry about leaving me alone. His recognition that I'd sacrificed my own dreams for our family, it was all there, pure and honest. When the recording ended, the silence in the room was deafening. Claire, David said, his voice barely above a whisper. Tell me you didn't do this. Claire's mask finally slipped completely. Her perfect composure cracked, revealing something desperate and ugly underneath. David, you have to understand. I was trying to help her. Margaret's been living in denial about her marriage, idealizing something that wasn't as perfect as she remembers. I thought if she knew the truth... The truth? I interrupted. You mean the truth that my husband was grateful for our life together? That he loved the woman I'd become? That his only regret was that he couldn't grow old with me? He was medicated, Claire snapped, her voice rising. He didn't know what he was saying. Exactly. He was a sick, confused man. And you exploited that. You took his vulnerable moments and twisted them into weapons to torture his widow. David stood up abruptly, running his hands through his hair. My God, Claire. Dad was dying. He was out of his mind on pain medication half the time. How could you use that against Mom? I was trying to help her face reality. Claire's voice was becoming shrill. She's been living in a fantasy, thinking her marriage was some great love story. I thought it would be healthier for her to know the truth. What truth? I asked. That Robert wondered sometimes about paths not taken. That's not the same as regretting the path he chose. That he noticed I'd changed over 43 years? That's not the same as missing who I used to be. You took normal human thoughts and feelings and presented them as evidence that he was trapped and unhappy. But why? David asked his wife, his voice breaking. Why would you do something so cruel? Claire looked between us, trapped and desperate. For a moment I thought she might confess, might explain what had driven her to such calculated cruelty. Instead, she chose to double down. Because she needed to know. Because everyone's been tiptoeing around Margaret for 2 years, treating her like some grieving saint, when the reality is that her marriage wasn't the perfect romance she's convinced herself it was. The venom in her voice was shocking. This wasn't someone who had made a mistake or acted impulsively. This was someone who genuinely believed she had the right to destroy another person's peace of mind for her own twisted purposes. "Get out," David said quietly. Claire turned to him, her eyes wide. "What? Get out of this house! Get out now! David, you can't be serious. I'm your wife. You're a stranger. The woman I married wouldn't have done something like this. I don't know who you are, but you're not the person I thought I loved." Claire looked at me with pure hatred. "This is what you wanted, isn't it? To turn my husband against me, to destroy my marriage because you can't stand seeing your son happy with someone else." The accusation was so absurd it almost made me laugh. "Claire, I didn't destroy your marriage. You did. The moment you decided to torture a grieving widow with lies about her dead husband." She stood up, her hands shaking with rage. "Fine. But don't think this is over. I have lawyers, Margaret. I have rights in this marriage, in this family. You haven't won anything, haven't I?" I smiled for the first time in weeks. "I have my peace back. I know my husband loved me until the day he died. I know our marriage was real and beautiful and everything I thought it was. What more could I possibly win?" Claire grabbed her purse and stormed toward the door, but she turned back one more time. "David, when you realize what you're giving up, when you see how manipulative your mother really is, it'll be too late. I won't take you back." After she left, David and I sat in silence for several minutes. Finally, he spoke. "Mom, I'm so sorry. I can't believe she did this to you, to Dad's memory. How could you have known? She's very skilled at deception. I should have seen it. There were signs, things that didn't add up, but I was so—" He trailed off, unable to finish. "So in love," I finished for him. "Love makes us blind to things we don't want to see." He nodded, tears in his eyes. "What happens now?" I stood up, feeling lighter than I had in weeks. "Now you heal. Now we both remember who we are without Claire's poison in our lives. Now we honor your father's memory the way it deserves to be honored." As I drove home that afternoon, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Robert's death. Genuine peace. The recording had given me back more than just the truth about Claire's manipulation. It had given me back my husband's voice, his love, his final thoughts about our life together. But as I pulled into my driveway, I realized this wasn't over yet. Claire had made one final threat, and I had a feeling she wasn't done trying to hurt my family. I needed to be ready for whatever came next. 3 days after the confrontation, Claire's revenge began exactly as I'd expected it would, through Emma. David called me Tuesday morning, his voice tight with anger and exhaustion. "Mom, we need to talk. Claire's been calling Emma directly." My granddaughter was only 8 years old, too young to understand the adult complexities that had torn her parents' marriage apart, but old enough to be confused and hurt by her mother's sudden absence from their home. "What is she telling her?" I asked, though I already dreaded the answer. "She's saying you turned me against her, that you lied about Daddy because you were jealous of their relationship. She told Emma that Grandpa had secrets about our family that you don't want anyone to know." The calculated cruelty of it made my stomach turn. Claire was willing to damage an 8-year-old child's sense of security to get back at me. She was poisoning Emma against me the same way she'd tried to poison me against Robert's memory. "David, you have to stop those calls. I've tried. I changed Emma's phone number, but Claire knows her school schedule, her friends' houses. She's finding ways to reach her." His voice cracked slightly. "Emma asked me yesterday if Grandpa really said mean things about you. I didn't know what to tell her. That afternoon, I drove to Emma's school and waited in the pickup line, something I'd done countless times over the years. When Emma climbed into my car, her usually bright demeanor was subdued. "Hi, Grandma," she said quietly, buckling her seatbelt. "Hello, sweetheart. How was school today?" "Okay, I guess." She was quiet for a moment, then said, "Grandma, Mommy called me during lunch recess. She said some confusing things." I pulled over into a parking lot, my hands gripping the steering wheel. "What kind of confusing things?" "She said you have a secret about Grandpa, a mean secret that you don't want Daddy to know. But I don't understand why you would keep secrets about Grandpa. He was nice. Looking at Emma's troubled face, I made a decision that I knew Claire was counting on me to make. I was going to tell an 8-year-old child at least part of the truth, because the alternative was letting Claire's lies take root in her young mind. Emma, sometimes adults say things that aren't true when they're angry or hurt. Your mother is very upset right now because Daddy asked her to leave our house. She's saying things about me and Grandpa that aren't true because she wants to hurt us back. So Grandpa didn't say mean things about you? No, sweetheart. Grandpa loved me very much, just like I loved him. When people are sick like Grandpa was, sometimes they get confused by their medicine. Your mother used that confusion to make me think Grandpa said things he never really said. Emma's eyes widened. That's not nice. No, it's not nice at all. But now I know the truth, and that's why Daddy asked Mommy to leave. Because lying about someone who can't defend themselves is a very serious thing to do. Is Mommy going to keep calling me? I don't know, honey, but if she does, I want you to remember something very important. Grandpa loved all of us. You, me, Daddy, and yes, even Mommy. He would never want any of us to be mean to each other or to tell lies that hurt people. Okay? Emma nodded, but I could see the confusion and sadness in her eyes. Claire's poison was already working, creating doubt and fear in a child who should have been protected from adult conflicts. That evening, I called my lawyer. Richard Hartley had handled Robert's will and our family's legal affairs for 20 years. He was a pragmatic man in his 70s who didn't believe in unnecessary drama, which made his reaction to my story particularly telling. Margaret, what you're describing sounds like harassment and possibly parental alienation. We could pursue a restraining order, but that might escalate things further. What do you suggest? Document everything. Every call, every contact with Emma, every interaction. If Claire is determined to wage a war against your family, we need evidence of her behavior patterns. There's something else, Richard. I'm worried about what Claire might do next. She mentioned having lawyers, having rights in the marriage. What kind of damage could she cause David financially? Richard was quiet for a moment. In a divorce, she'd be entitled to half their marital assets. The house you helped them buy, David's retirement accounts, any joint investments. If she's vindictive enough, she could drag the proceedings out for years, costing David tens of thousands in legal fees. The thought of Claire profiting from her cruelty, of David losing his home and financial security because he'd stood up for his father's memory and his mother's peace of mind, filled me with cold rage. Richard, I want you to do something for me. I want you to research Claire's background, professional history, previous relationships, anything that might show a pattern of this kind of behavior. That could be expensive, Margaret. I don't care. This woman tried to destroy my memory of my marriage with Robert. Now she's targeting my granddaughter and threatening my son's financial future. I want to know exactly who we're dealing with. The investigation took 2 weeks. What Richard's private investigator found exceeded even my worst expectations about Claire's character. Her real name was Claire Morrison, not Claire Davidson as she'd told David. She'd been married once before, to a man named Thomas Morrison in Ohio. That marriage had ended in an acrimonious divorce after Claire was caught having an affair with her husband's business partner. But the most damning information was what had happened after the divorce. Thomas Morrison had died in a car accident 6 months after their divorce was finalized. Claire had sued his estate, claiming he'd been psychologically abusive during their marriage and that she deserved additional compensation beyond what the divorce settlement had awarded her. She'd produced recordings of Thomas supposedly admitting to being a terrible husband, confessing regrets about their marriage, expressing thoughts about other women. The recordings had been dismissed by the court as evidence of a man under severe emotional distress, possibly manipulated or taken out of context. But Claire had used them to wage a public campaign against Thomas's memory, turning his friends and family against him even after his death. The pattern was identical to what she'd tried to do to Robert and me. My God, Richard said when we met to discuss the findings. This woman is a predator. She targets vulnerable men, extracts intimate information, and then uses it as a weapon against their families. We have to stop her, I said. Not just for our family, but for any future families she might target. What do you have in mind? I thought about Claire's final threat, her promise that this wasn't over, her willingness to use Emma as a pawn in her revenge. Then I thought about Thomas Morrison. a man who died thinking his friends and family believed the worst about him. "I want to set a trap," I said. "I want Claire to reveal exactly who she is, in a way that can't be dismissed or explained away." That night, I called David with my plan. "Mom, I don't know. It sounds risky. What if she doesn't take the bait?" "She will, because Claire can't resist the opportunity to hurt people, and she thinks she's smarter than everyone else. Her arrogance is her weakness." "What do you need me to do?" "Call her. Tell her you've been thinking about what she said, that maybe you were too hasty in asking her to leave. Tell her you want to meet somewhere neutral to discuss reconciliation." "Where?" "The cancer center. Robert's old room. Tell her you think it would be meaningful to talk there, since that's where she claims to have connected with Dad." David was quiet for a long moment. "You think she'll agree to that?" "I think she'll see it as the perfect opportunity to twist the knife one more time. She'll want to be in the place where she manipulated Dad, to remind you of her supposed intimate connection with him. And then what? Then we'll see exactly what Claire does when she thinks she's won. Because people like Claire can't help but gloat, and when they do, they reveal their true nature." The plan was simple but effective. Claire would come to the cancer center expecting to manipulate David back into her web. Instead, she would find herself facing the consequences of her actions in the place where she'd first committed them. But there was one more element to my trap, something I hadn't told David yet. Something that would ensure Claire could never hurt another family the way she'd hurt ours. Because I'd learned something important about Claire Morrison during our weeks of psychological warfare. She couldn't resist the opportunity to record her victories, to document the pain she caused others. And this time, I was going to make sure her recording would be the evidence that destroyed her. The meeting was set for Friday afternoon. Claire had agreed immediately, just as I'd predicted. Her eagerness to return to the scene of her crime told me everything I needed to know about her psychological makeup. She thought she was walking into her final triumph. She had no idea she was walking into her complete destruction. Friday afternoon arrived gray and cold, matching my mood as I drove to the cancer center. David had agreed to meet Claire there at 3 o'clock, ostensibly to discuss reconciliation. What Claire didn't know was that I would be there too, along with Richard and the private investigator he'd hired. More importantly, what Claire didn't know was that the cancer center's security office had been very interested to learn that someone had been claiming to conduct unauthorized pharmaceutical consultations on their premises. They'd agreed to provide us with access to their security footage from Robert's treatment period, footage that would definitively prove whether Claire had ever been there during his appointments. I arrived early and positioned myself in the family consultation room adjacent to the oncology wing where Robert had received his treatments. Through the partially open door, I could see the hallway where David would meet Claire. Richard sat beside me, his briefcase full of documentation about Claire's past, ready to present evidence that would ensure she could never hurt another family. At exactly 3 o'clock, I heard Claire's heels clicking against the hospital's polished floors. She'd dressed carefully for this meeting, a black dress that suggested mourning and reconciliation, her hair pulled back in a style that made her look younger and more vulnerable. Even now, she was manipulating her appearance to serve her purposes. "David," I heard her say, her voice carrying that familiar blend of hurt and hope. "Thank you for agreeing to meet me here. I know this place has difficult memories for both of us." "It does," David replied, his voice carefully neutral. "That's why I thought it was important to talk here, where you say you connected with Dad. I'm so glad you're finally ready to hear the truth about that. Your mother has filled your head with lies about me, about what really happened between your father and me." I watched through the door crack as Claire moved closer to David, her hand reaching out to touch his arm in a gesture of intimate familiarity. "Tell me again about your conversations with him," David said. "I want to understand what really happened." Claire's face lit up with satisfaction. She thought she was winning him back, thought she could rewrite history one more time. "Your father was so lonely during those final weeks," she began, her voice taking on that practiced tone of sympathetic revelation. "He told me things he couldn't tell your mother because he didn't want to hurt her more than necessary." "What kinds of things?" "About their marriage, about how it had been over for years, really. How he'd stayed out of obligation rather than love. He was quite specific about it, actually. As she spoke, I noticed something that confirmed my suspicions about Claire's psychological makeup. She was reaching into her purse, pulling out what looked like a small digital recording device. She was recording this conversation, documenting what she believed would be her final victory over our family. He recorded some of his thoughts near the end, Claire continued, her fingers working the small device. Voice memos about his regrets, his true feelings about your mother, things he never had the courage to say directly. My heart raced. She was claiming to have recordings of Robert, either fabricated ones or manipulated versions of his confused ramblings. This was how she'd planned to cement her victory, by producing evidence of Robert's supposed unhappiness. I'd like to hear those recordings, David said carefully. I thought you might. That's why I brought this. She held up the device. But I want you to promise me something first. Promise me that after you hear your father's real feelings, you'll reconsider our marriage. Your mother has poisoned you against me, but this will prove that she's been living in denial about who your father really was. I promise, David lied smoothly. Claire pressed play, and Robert's voice filled the hallway, but immediately I could tell something was wrong. The voice was clearer than it should have been for someone in Robert's condition, and the words were more coherent than his medication-addled state would have allowed. Margaret has become such a burden, the voice said. I regret staying in this marriage for so long. I should have left years ago, should have found someone who understood me the way Claire does. It was Robert's voice, but the words were wrong, the tone artificial. She had taken fragments of his recordings and used technology to create new sentences, new admissions that had never actually been spoken. You see, Claire said triumphantly, he trusted me with his real feelings because he knew I would understand. Your mother has been living a lie for 2 years. That was when I stepped out of the consultation room, Richard and the investigator behind me. The only one living a lie is you, Claire, I said. She spun around, her face going white when she saw us. What are you doing here? Watching you commit fraud, Richard said calmly. That recording you just played is fabricated. We have the original recordings of Robert's voice memos, and none of them contain the words you just claimed to have captured. Claire's composure cracked slightly, but she rallied quickly. You're lying. You're all conspiring against me because you can't handle the truth about Robert's feelings. The truth is easily verified, the investigator said, stepping forward. We've obtained the security footage from this facility covering the entire period of Robert's treatment. You never set foot in this building during his care. You were never here for work meetings, pharmaceutical consultations, or personal visits. Claire's hand tightened on her recording device. That's impossible. The footage from that long ago would have been deleted. Not medical facility footage, Richard said. They're required to maintain security records for 7 years. Every visitor, every vendor, every employee is documented. Your name appears nowhere in their logs. I watched Claire's face as the reality of her situation sank in. She'd been caught in multiple lies, and the evidence against her was overwhelming. Even if that's true, she said desperately, it doesn't change what Robert told me during our phone conversations. He called me regularly during his illness, confiding things he couldn't tell Margaret. Phone records, the investigator said simply. We've subpoenaed Robert's phone records from his final 6 months. He made no calls to your number and received none from you. The only calls between your households were the standard family coordination calls between you and David. Claire's mask was disintegrating completely now. The perfectly composed woman who'd walked in expecting to destroy our family was revealing herself as the desperate predator she really was. This is harassment, she said, her voice rising. You're invading my privacy, fabricating evidence. We're documenting a pattern, Richard interrupted. A pattern we found in Ohio, where you did exactly the same thing to your first husband's family after his death. Claire went completely still. I don't know what you're talking about, Thomas Morrison, I said quietly. Your first husband, the man you accused of psychological abuse using fabricated recordings after he died in a car accident. The family you destroyed with lies and manipulation. For the first time since I'd known her, Claire had no response. She stood there clutching her fake recording device, exposed and cornered. The question now, Richard continued, is what happens next. We could pursue criminal charges for harassment, fraud, and attempted extortion. We could ensure that your pattern of behavior becomes part of the public record, making it difficult for you to target future families. Or, I said, stepping closer to her, you could disappear. Leave David alone. Leave Emma alone. Leave our family alone forever. Move somewhere far away and never contact any of us again. Claire looked between us, calculating her options. I could see her mind working, trying to find some angle, some manipulation that might still save her. You can't prove any of this in court, she said finally. It's all circumstantial. Try us, David said, speaking for the first time since we'd revealed ourselves. I've heard enough to know exactly who you are, Claire. You're a predator who feeds on grief and vulnerability. You tried to destroy my mother's memory of my father, and you used my dying father's confusion against his own family. Claire's face contorted with rage. Fine, but don't think this makes you better than me. Your mother is a bitter old woman who couldn't stand to see her son happy with someone else. She orchestrated all of this because she's jealous of what we had. What we had, David said quietly, was built on lies. Everything you told me about yourself, about your feelings for our family, about your interactions with my father, all of it was manipulation designed to give you access to people you could hurt. Claire stood there for another moment, then did something that revealed her true character one final time. She raised her recording device and tried to delete the fabricated confession she'd just played, but the investigator was faster, taking the device from her hands before she could destroy the evidence. That recording will be analyzed by forensic audio specialists, he told her. They'll be able to prove it was artificially constructed from fragments of other recordings. With that final defeat, Claire's composure collapsed entirely. She looked at each of us with pure hatred, then turned and walked away without another word. Her heels clicked against the hospital floor one last time as she disappeared around the corner. 6 months later, I received a letter from an attorney in Florida. Claire had filed for divorce from David, demanding half their marital assets, but Richard had been ready for this too. David's financial assets had been protected through a post-nuptial agreement that voided Claire's claims in cases of fraud or deception within the marriage. The forensic analysis of Claire's recording device had provided the evidence we needed. She received nothing from the divorce except the requirement to stay at least 500 miles away from our family and never contact Emma directly. David sold the house they'd shared and bought a smaller one closer to me. Emma adjusted well to the changes, especially once the confusing phone calls from her mother stopped. She still asked about Claire sometimes, but the questions became less frequent as her sense of security returned. As for me, I found something I hadn't expected in the aftermath of Claire's exposure: genuine peace, not just relief that her manipulation had been revealed, but a deep sense of closure about Robert's final weeks. The real recordings we'd found, the ones Claire had tried to exploit, showed me a man who loved me until his last breath, a man who worried about leaving me alone, who was grateful for our life together, who saw his death as a tragedy not because of regrets about our marriage, but because it would end something beautiful. On the first anniversary of Claire's exposure, I did something I hadn't been able to do since Robert's death. I visited his grave without pain, without doubt, without the poison Claire had tried to inject into my memories. I know the truth now, I told him, placing fresh flowers on his headstone. I know you loved me. I know our marriage was real and beautiful, and everything I thought it was. The wind rustled through the trees above his grave, and for a moment, I could almost hear his voice again, not confused by medication, not manipulated by a predator, but clear and strong, and full of the love that had sustained us for 43 years. Claire had tried to steal that love from me, but she had failed. Love, real love, can't be destroyed by lies or manipulation or the calculated cruelty of someone who has never experienced it herself. In the end, that was Claire's greatest weakness. She understood how to exploit love, how to manipulate it and twist it into a weapon, but she had never actually felt it. And that made all the difference. Because love, true love, always finds a way to survive.